The internet today has changed everything, including how we think about writing. No longer a solitary act involving one person and one pen, writing today incorporates images, sounds, and hyperlinks. As our understanding of writing evolves, so do the types of text that students bring to the Writing Center. Once places that worked exclusively with hard copies of written documents, Writing Center tutorials now accommodate a wide variety of multimodal texts, including PowerPoints, videos, and blogs. But what does this shift in tutoring material mean for tutoring pedagogy? This question has been circulating among Writing Center scholars ever since the early days of the popular internet. It began in 1996 when a collective of scholars known as the New London Group argued that the multiplicity of communication channels and increasing cultural and linguistic diversity in the world today call for a much broader view of literacy than portrayed by traditional language-based approaches, and that negotiating the multiple linguistic and cultural differences in our society is central to the pragmatics of the working, civic, and private lives of students. Since this early call to action, the conversation of multimodal tutoring pedagogy has split into two opposing strategies. On the one side, scholars believe that tutors can treat multimodal text the way they would any other text, and that if this is not sufficient, well, tough. According to Pemberton, we have to ask ourselves whether it is really the Writing Center's responsibility to be all things to all people. The other side of the argument believes that we do have a responsibility to be all these things. These scholars believe this so much, in fact, that they want Writing Centers to create separate multi-literacy centers just to deal with these multimodal texts. So where can we find middle ground here? Is the debate as simple as treat multimodal texts as you would any other text, or remove them into their own separate space? How can we integrate these other texts into our writing centers in a way that both recognizes the unique challenges of tutoring multimodal assignments and that draws from the strengths of writing center theory? Before we can answer these questions, we first need to look at why teachers are creating these assignments and what they hope their students will get out of writing multimodal texts. Let's begin by looking at what has been said on the subject at an international level. A few years ago, in a presentation at the Four Cs Conference, teachers from across the country said they employ multimodal assignments in order to teach their students rhetorical awareness and how to write text in a variety of modes. Similarly, Gunther Kress, a professor of semiotics at the University of London, insists that we need to resituate our notions of literacy to include both the dominance of the image over the word and the dominance of the screen over the page, because it is no longer possible to think about literacy in isolation from a vast array of social, technological, and economic factors. Back in the US, Cynthia Selfie agrees with Kress and believes that English composition teachers have got to be willing to expand their own understanding of composing beyond conventional bounds of the alphabet, to make it possible for students to practice, value, and understand a full range of literacies. Perhaps this view of literacy is necessary because, as Alan Ray and Doug White point out, issues of audience and purpose remain as important in web text as in print text. Now that we've established the broad conversation, why did the teachers at my own institution, the University of Delaware, include multimodal text in their classroom? Let's find out.
I think that when you shift from writing in a traditional paper, document type of form, and then you have to take that and turn it into something else, I think that the rhetorical decisions that one has to make doing that are really important, and I want them thinking about audience in a different way. And so for me, saying, hey, you're gonna have to make this into a video, and you can't put everything in it, that is going to require them to make that move, and that's why I thought the video would be a good choice.
I also thought that it can help students to see in a different way what we mean when we talk about audience or rhetorical purpose. I think that that currently with the text we have, like the Allen and Bacon or things like that, does that really well, but this is just another way in which to think of writing as something different.
Okay, so now that we know why these texts are being assigned, we have to ask ourselves why the Writing Center is the proper place to help students work on these assignments. Let's recap the motivations for creating these assignments. Attention to audience, rhetorical awareness, clarity, importance of argument. These sound a lot like the things that are part of the traditional text we already work with. And perhaps they should, because, as Lester Fagley reminds us, to read any text, a reader pulls meaning from a system of signs: letters, words, sentences, paragraphs, shapes, colors, pictures. So when we say multimodal texts are non-traditional, what do we consider the traditional text that is its opposite? Perhaps it is the text that Pemberton describes as structured linearly and hierarchically, moving along a single path from beginning to end, following well-known and universally taught discourse forms that have emerged from a rhetorical tradition. But this isn't how Writing Center pedagogy operates. We don't always approach text linearly. We don't move along a single path. We jump around, skip sections completely, or focus only on middle passages. So maybe people more entrenched in Writing Center work will have a better idea of what the traditional Writing Center text is. Let's find out.
I would define a traditional text as something that doesn't have a strong visual component.
Okay.
Because if you're looking at a paper, there is a slight visual component to it. You know, you want to have proper indentation. If you have like a block quote, you want to make sure that that's structured right. But it's, you know, black and white, like there's not really images associated with it. I would maybe even say that like a traditional text that has images incorporated would be verging on a non-traditional text.
Like, I guess either like a research paper, 5-paragraph essay, that kind of thing,
Okay.
with a thesis supporting and then a conclusion.
The way that I would define a traditional text is that it's bound by the edges of a page.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that there's something, even if you read it digitally, it somehow still looks like a page. I would argue that taking a text that is like an 8 to 10 page research paper and putting it onto a web page, if it doesn't have any other active changes that are made, I would still consider that to be a traditional text. If you aren't linking, if you're not adding any multimedia elements of it, just the fact that it's on a virtual platform doesn't in and of itself transform it into something else. So I guess that would be the way I would define it. You know, that familiar text that we all work with every day, all day.
These are all good options, but they are all different. And if we can't agree on what a traditional text is, then how can we agree on what is non-traditional? Perhaps these boundaries between the traditional and non-traditional texts that we work with aren't as concrete as we thought. But even if the distinctions between traditional and non-traditional texts are blurry, the Writing Center tutors at the University of Delaware still feel like they need extra training in working with multimodal texts.
I think it would definitely help, especially because it's becoming a more prevalent kind of assignment. So, it makes me a little bit nervous when I get a non-traditional text because I don't feel like I'm as qualified to work on it as I am on just like a straight up paper.
I do think it is increasing the amount of multimodal text we do receive. Our training does need to reflect that, so we should get a little bit more emphasis.
And we can't discount these desires for specialized training because, after all, there are differences in multimodal and traditional texts. Aside from the obvious differences of visual and sound components, there are also differences with how tutors and tutees approach these assignments. In her talk at the 2014 4Cs, Barbara Lutz argued for the importance of recognizing these differences and noted that instructors and tutors and tutees approach multimodal assignments from drastically different angles. While we can all agree on what an academic text is supposed to look like and what type of material it can contain, the word blog or website connote very different meanings depending on personal experiences. Lutz argues that while an older instructor may think of a blog in terms of a news site or other information-heavy text, a student may imagine a blog to be solely a space of lighthearted entertainment. But these differences are not necessarily a bad thing. Indeed, because peer tutors are also students, they would, in Lutz's reading, approach the blog assignment the same way that students of the class would. In other words, working over an assignment like this makes the tutor and the tutee peers. So why does this matter? Well, Writing Center theory emphasizes the importance of peer learning. That's why when you go to many writing centers, you won't see professional writing tutors or writing teachers. Instead, you'll see these centers staffed by graduate and undergraduate students, or what writing centers refer to as peer tutors. Yet, as these peer tutors will tell you, this notion of being a peer is very complicated.
Obviously, I see them, you know, academically as my peer, like we're on the same level, but at the same time, like, I can't pretend that I don't have more experience with writing than they do. While it is like a fairly balanced relationship, there's no denying that, like, there is a little bit of, like, underneath upper hand.
Sometimes it is a bit noticeable when there is this kind of jump or distance in knowledge about the subject. Whether it's my knowledge about writing techniques or it's their knowledge about a specific subject, so if they come in with like a doctorate thesis or something like that. So as far as the knowledge gap, that's always kind of noticeable.
While yes, technically these students are peers, the tutee is still asking the tutor for help. Through doing so, they inherently form a hierarchical relationship that places the tutor at the top and the tutee at the bottom, thus destroying the peer relationship. But according to these Writing Center tutors, working with multimodal text makes them feel like they are on more even ground with their tutees.
You're not the professional, I guess you could say. You're basically starting off on the same playing field, and they know more about the project because they've been working on it, and you're kind of coming in fresh. So by all means, I definitely say that makes you more equal, more of a peer.
As soon as we both get off of our kind of common footing, we're forced to kind of look at it from a similar position because of a lack of experience. So I feel like it does make us maybe not more peers, but it does decrease the knowledge gap at least.
So in many ways, these multimodal texts allow for the actualization of Writing Center theory that the traditional texts of the Writing Center do not. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. Let's take a second to recap. What do we know so far? Well, we know that teachers assign multimodal texts because they want students to work on aspects of writing that Writing Center tutors are trained in, and that this makes sense because these multimodal texts really aren't that different from the traditional texts of the Writing Center. In fact, they might even be better for Writing Center work than the other texts. But to return to our initial question, what does this all mean for Writing Center pedagogy? How do we train our tutors to account for these various factors? In a perfect world, we could include all of the training that these Writing Center tutors crave. We could give lengthy lessons on visual rhetoric, the nuances of video production, and how to evaluate sounds. Everyone would go into working with multimodal texts with the utmost confidence. It would be great. But it's not a perfect world, and Writing Center tutors do not have the amount of time that this type of training would require. And although multimodal texts are appearing more frequently in Writing Centers, they currently only make up about 1% of the texts that are brought into the Writing Center at UD. On the other hand, ASL students, a common group that tutors request more training and assisting, make up about 50%. And to add further to this problem, Writing Center tutors are peer tutors, which means that they are incredibly busy. Many of them take full class loads while participating in a variety of other organizations, and some of them even have separate jobs. So they barely have enough time to get in the minimal amount of necessary training, let alone copious amounts of supplementary training. So what do we do? Well, maybe we're already training these tutors to work with multimodal texts, and we just don't realize it. Instead of seeing these texts as wholly the same or wholly different, we need to see them as a certain genre of text. We all work with many different genres every day, from advanced biology dissertations to freshman composition analyses to graduate school personal statements. All of these forms provide different challenges and require different strategies, but because they all look roughly the same, we just generally treat them as they are. By realizing that we are already master adapters, that there is no singular traditional text, we'll be able to realize that we already have the skills necessary to work with these non-traditional texts. That we are always already tutors, regardless of the text that we work with.